And I'm happy to be able and to have the privilege to talk to you and to be able to pass this hour with you. I always like participating here. I love this force that is beaming forth from men, from purely masculine communities. It's different from mixed societies. I'm a brain researcher. I always deal with the crucial question, what is needed so that things come together, fall into place? So what is needed to create this high degree of collective togetherness? I have been working for years as an experimental brain researcher, a student of the brain. I have a certain foundation on which I place my feet. Starting from this solid foundation, I could venture into the world. It's always a bad thing if you do not have a foundation or a base. My first great discovery as a brain researcher who as a specialist for synapses created by serotonin. Then I found out, well, this brain comes always attached to a body. So independently of the body, nothing can happen in the brain. And what's happening in the body affects also the brain and vice versa. For example, if we pass this hour together, it would be great if the odd man then had a fluttering in the cardiac rhythm, because I try to trigger certain root causes so as not to get hooked up with phenomena that can be observed, but go down to the depth of the root causes. So the body is part and parcel of the consideration of the brain. And we human beings are social beings, even men. And our entire experience is shaped by exchange with others. It's so deeply rooted that normally we do not appreciate it. Nothing of what anybody has gotten in their brains would have succeeded if there hadn't been other human beings that had shown you how you can learn to speak, to write, to operate a computer, to ride a bicycle. Our social cohesion, our social integration is so deep that it is nonsensical to look into a single brain. For example, what is a depression? What has changed in the course of a depression? Because this anxiety disorder was not created by the brain, but because he has had shitty experiences in warped relationships. So that's how I decided to move away from the profile of the serotonin praise and uptick academic student, but there is no academic career in for me. For this science or academia does not reserve any places for somebody like me for such approaches. I'm refining the last version of my latest book, something that has been on my mind for 2 or 3 years. We inform ourselves to death. It's going to be exciting. I'm afraid that the media will not give me many favorable reviews. In this book, well, what is it? 1784, one man anticipated everything that I believe to have discovered with painstaking effort, which deeply impressed me. And his name is Immanuel Kant. Maybe someone knows him still. He wrote a book, Response to the question, what is enlightenment? I think you share my feeling. You think that enlightenment is if I enlighten you about something, if I explain everything to you, so if I give you information, enlightenment. All the people tend to consider themselves very enlightened. And he says enlightenment is the exodus of man of the self-inflicted powerlessness. Powerlessness is the incapacity to use one's mind without direction by somebody else. And it is self-inflicted, this power impotence, if the cause of the same is not due to the lack of reasoning, but to the lack of decision and courage to use its brain or its reason without direction by somebody else. So it's not about insights, information, or data. Enlightenment, if it is really enlightenment, it's about doing something so that you make best use of what you have in your brain. Independently of your degree of education, it's rather about finding out, well, what is essential, what matters in life. Probably it's something different for everybody. For all, it's probably the same for so many of us, and we should take it enough seriously to consider this and to reflect. And then he continues, I need to quote it. It's so nicely formulated, it somehow left me... I have seen that cowardice and also laziness are the main reasons why so many people love to remain in the state of slavery despite all the efforts they undertake, and why it is so easy for others to become their lords. It's so cozy if I have a book that tells me how things go, a pastor that cares about my soul. I don't have to take any extra effort. It's not necessary to think for myself. Others will take on this business if I pay them. First, they have enslaved their cattle so that this cattle could not go out of their stables and prisons in which they had been enslaved. Afterwards, they show them the risks that are looming if they try to go their way on their own. Now, this risk is not as big as you might think, because by falling down several times, they would learn how to walk. However, one example includes a certain shyness and will terrify you and will frighten you away. So it's so difficult for any human being to work their way out of the impotence and the slavery in which they have slumped themselves. So statutes, formulas, mechanical instruments of a reasonable use, or rather abuse, of the natural gifts are the shackles of an ever-growing slavery. Whoever wanted to unleash them would still have a leap of uncertainty to do, because he's not used to free movements. Therefore, only a few have succeeded in freeing themselves from the slavery and to unfold their capacities while still doing a stable walk on their own feet. Isn't that insane? That's insane. That's unbelievable what Immanuel Kant wrote here. Because this means that true education, as we operate it at schools, is not the one thing that you need. What you need is an education that enables you to use those things that you have learned and that you have gotten insight into. So it's an exciting question. What has happened to us so that we don't do this? Well, and the answer to this question is we live in a world in which, while growing into this world, we are pushed into situations where we have to coerce ourselves to separate our feeling, our thinking, and our emotions. We are separated from ourselves. It's not the others that do this, but we do it on our own. A quick example, a father that passed by a church, and there was also a beggar. You have seen this. father walks by with a 3 or 4-year-old son. The son looks at the beggar and looks immediately at the pa, and he watches dad's glance, that he feels unease and he feels uncomfortable. So his natural sympathy for this beggar must be suppressed because pa or dad has a problem with it. Now pa walks around the next corner, and if there is somebody who has grown up in the, well, probably he will bend down. Max, and a cognitive explanation is given why pa or why daddy hasn't helped this beggar. This natural sympathy of the boy is suppressed by a cognitive explanation, is discarded. So the boy knows how he is supposed to think if he encounters next time a beggar. I think this is the major evil in our time. We see things that shouldn't be like that, but we are separated from ourselves. We are no longer able to delve into our own feelings, so that we need to fill up this and to cover it up with so many cognitive explanations and reasoning. And then the question arises, how come? As a brain student, well, it's my big moment. You weren't born in this status of separateness, because thinking, feeling, and acting is always one. The small baby is linked to mother and to dad. It's always feeling, thinking, and acting together, which is so magical, which makes them so lively, by the way. And then the time arrives. Well, a long time they come out of the mother's womb. Well, they have learned so much. Well, it's very ingenious to think that we have learned nothing inside the mother's womb, because we have learned how to move our arms and legs, and the brain has tried to figure out what's going on, all those impulses. The embryos have already started regulating their functions. They have a brain that is the fitting counterpiece to the body and brain. Well, it was insane to believe, a theory from the previous century, from the age of machine, that there is a design, genetic programming that leads to the development of the brain in the way that it is. No, there is not such a design. Genetically, there is much more initiated than would be actually needed. So while on the way, the brain is formed. If you work into a certain family with a dad in Berlin, on top of that, in a certain environment, in a certain culture here in Germany, then you accrue certain experiences. These experiences are anchored into the brain. And then you fit into this world with your brain. Let's take a closer look at this. In the first years of your life, until the third birthday, well, we can painstakingly remember we are small discoverers and surveyors. And what can you discover? You are charting the uncharted territory. It's a playful trying out of what is possible. You are the designer of your own learning process. You structure your own brain by playing around with your environment. This leads also to the interconnection of the various nerve cells in an appropriate way. And then, finally, you reach a situation, you have parents, you encounter the older people, and this joy of discovery and this joy of shaping is not shared by everybody. We call this education. And then, from parental love, the child is morphed, well, it becomes the object of the parental aspirations, expectations, assessments, and also instructions and orders, which is the worst thing that can happen to any child, because it triggers something in the brain, which is called arousal by neurobiologists. You have a problem on your hands, as with any problem. If you have a problem for which you do not know a quick solution, you have an arousal, you have a chaotic mixture, the nerve cells gobble up a lot of energy. That's something that the brain must not allow, due to the fact that all living systems, not only the brain, but also the organs, even an ant's heap, and also an individual cell, also a company, an entire society. Anything living on this Earth, anything shaping a living system, must try to keep up a certain essential functionality at the lowest possible energetic level, which is the biggest insight in my whole career as a brain researcher. As banal as it may sound, it has nothing to do with biology. It comes from the second main principle of thermodynamics. If you cannot keep things together, they are dispersed and the energy is then scattered around in the world. So life has concocted this great artifact to resist the second main principle of thermodynamics. Therefore, it tries continuously, whenever a problem pops up that creates chaos, to stop this status by looking for interconnections so as to achieve a better fit and stop the chaos.
And this state where all of this could fit well together, this state, that's a moment that you all know. That's the feeling when you have when everything seems to fall into place, you feel connected to yourself. The way you think, the way you act, the way you feel is one and the same thing. And the experiences you make, well, are exactly what you expected to happen. You are part of a wonderful community. And maybe you really feel closely connected to nature or even the universe. That's an incredibly beautiful feeling. Everything is just right in such a moment. You hardly need any energy. And the only problem about this state is you will only achieve it when you're dead. It won't happen before you die. So, and that's something that we currently can't think of. Obviously, life needs these disturbances, the disturbances that occur, or the disruptions that occur over and over again. This idea, as soon as I open my eyes, there's light shining into my eyes, and something's going on in my brain automatically. And as soon as something is not coherent or consistent, if there's a problem, if there's something new I'm confronted with, if, as a child, when I believe I'm a great explorer, all of a sudden I'm criticized for that by others, well, then the whole thing becomes totally inconsistent in my brain, and I need a solution. And here's another wisdom that we learned from neurobiology. What the brain remembers is never the problems we've had, but the solutions we've found. The problem is, these solutions don't always work. They're not always the right thing in the long run. But anyway, in that moment, of course, the first thing to do is to get rid of the chaos, of the arousal. Now, you can also ask yourselves, what kind of solution did you find when you discovered the fact that you have never been unconditionally loved? Because that's what it should have been like. You should have been unconditionally loved, because these are the basic needs you have when you come into this world. When you're born, you have this need to connect, just like you were connected to your mother the 9 months before you were born. So this is planted in your brain, this wish to connect. And apart from that, during the 9 months before your birth, you learned lots of new things every day. You created new networks and connections every day inside your brain, and that's why you become an explorer. And then you leave your mother's womb, you start your life outside your mother, and you have this urge to explore. And later on, we call this an urge for autonomy and freedom. So we have these two urges, these two goals, to connect and to be autonomous and free. And if you are turned into an object, then these two urges are not respected. Just think about yourself. You're sitting there as though you can't really enjoy what I'm telling you. And as long as you're sitting there like that, in that posture, things won't work. No. This little bit of connection that we've just created is lost when you're sitting there like that. Now, when I criticize you like that, then of course this destroys everything. And this is exactly a problem that everybody experiences as soon as he becomes the object, the target of judgment and orders, like I've just illustrated that, like I've just demonstrated that. And of course you have like this other urge as well, to be an autonomous person who can sit there the way you want to. Or you can be a child that wants to create something the way it wants to. And then somebody comes along and says, no, you have to do it the other way, you have to do it this way, or you have to do it that way. And then the child is told what to do and what not to do. And of course that means the child can't really explore and create anymore. The problem for a child is the child can't change the world of the adults. And that's why the child needs to find some kind of solution, because it can't live with this inconsistency, with this chaos inside the child's head. By the way, you know, there are these farmers that grow fruit. They have these little trees and they tie the trunks of the trees to, well, to wires to make sure they grow the right way. And I found out that, or I learned or heard that when these farmers, when they tie the trunks and the branches of their trees to wires in order to make them grow the right way, they call that Erziehung in German, which means education. So, yeah, Erziehung, education, that's how they call it, when they make sure the tree will grow the right way. And when you hear the way these farmers use this word, then this makes it very clear what we all had to go through when we were educated, when we were raised. Now, they always say that our parental home leaves its, characterizes us, but that's not it. No, we are just confronted with a situation and we have to find a solution for ourselves. And as this is my solution, the one that I found, I will always relate to it. I will always identify myself with that solution. Now, the solution that we find for ourselves, first of all, it depends on whether you're a boy or a girl, because you also have a look at what the others do, what the other kids do. So one good solution, when somebody turns you into an object, is you turn that person into an object as well. You tell me I'm shit, then I tell you you're also shit. And some people learn that very early. They learn to react that way. Typically, they are the leaders, well, in the children's gangs, on the children's playgrounds, and they will also be the leaders in the classes at school. And yeah, you can really learn a lot from them in a way. And some of them are so good at that that they will become managers later on, or leading figures in the economy or in the political world. And then there are others. I hope not so many of you belong to that group. I mean, both is crap in a way. But anyway, when you have this problem that somebody turns you into an object, you can either turn that other person into an object as well, or you turn yourself into the object as well. When somebody criticizes you, then you say, yeah, you're right, I'm really no good. I'm not good at maths, I'm not good at sports. So in a way, this is consistent for the brain then. It saves you energy, because somebody tells you you're no good, and you say, yes, I know. So there's no discrepancy, no contradiction here. It's a very unpleasant solution in order to get rid of this inconsistency, this discrepancy. And so the reason why a child, a little boy, would react that way is simply in order to get rid of the contradictions. And apart from that, this boy also will then suppress his need for, well, belonging, for connecting, and also his urge, his need to discover and explore and create. The boy has to suppress all of that in order to accept that kind of criticism. And we all learn to do that, because otherwise we would have never made it through school. And I mean, it starts in your parental home and it goes on at school, and in the end, well, in our current society, it never really stops. In a way, it always goes on. There's always somebody who tells you what you should do and what you should not do. So, in a way, we live in a culture where we turn each other into an object. And this means that the potentials and talents that we have inside of us can never unfold. Because if you turn me into an object, I I'm just a person in need because I can't really fulfill my own needs anymore. I have this lack of coherence or consistency inside my brain, and I have to find a solution. And that, of course, means that I'm no longer open to this world where I have so far been able to do and see everything I wanted to. But now, see, as soon as I get into such a situation, I'm not open to the world anymore. I just look for a solution. And when the brain finally finds a solution to, well, get rid of this inconsistency, and then it can transform this energy-consuming arousal or chaos into an energy-saving tranquility. Now, there's one part of the brain that is called reward center. It's a part of the brain that releases substances that will then get in contact with other bodily cells, and they will then create nerve growth factors, which is hormone-like substances that will help other cells to release proteins in order to, well, get in contact with other neurons, with other nerve cells, the so-called synapses, in order to form them in you or to strengthen them. In other words, whenever you find a solution to a problem that caused some kind of lack of consistency, then with the help of that solution, you can make it all consistent. And those parts of the brain that you used in order to find a solution will then be strengthened in the brain. That's how it works. And that's how learning works. That is learning. Learning means find a solution to save energy in a world where you're always confronted with something new all the time. And then you fit into this world. Then you have learned how to behave, what to do in order to be allowed to be part of it. And you see, sometimes I'm a bit disrespectful. So I would say, if you pass your A-level exams and you get a very good mark, very good results, it doesn't mean you're particularly intelligent, but it just means you adapted very well. And 2 out of 3, when you think about the university courses that are currently very sought after, that everybody wants to go to, that everybody wants to participate in, 2 out of 3 spots there are occupied by girls and not by boys. So obviously girls manage to adapt themselves very well, whereas obviously boys don't really find successful ways to deal with this kind of treatment. So, and when you've gone through all of that, then you go out into the world, and then there are many people who never find their way back. You know, it all becomes solidified. You know, this negative self-perception becomes more and more firmly implanted into your brain, and the success strategies that you found in order to make sure that people don't turn you into an object all the time, that will also be consolidated in the brain, and then sooner or later you see yourself that way. You see, that's what I am. You know, I'm a control freak. I have to control everything. That's who I am. I am that kind of person. Or maybe I always try to convince other people how great I am. I'm just that kind of person. I have to do that. So, when you think about the friends and the people you know, then it's really getting interesting. You know, it's always because of the solutions they found for themselves. They all had a problem, probably pretty much the same problem, and they all find their own solutions. And then they go out, they walk through life, and unless a miracle happens, this person is not going to change again. Yeah. Sorry, this comment is off the mic, so it's not really audible. Well, the thing is, we are all born in a different way. We have made different kinds of prenatal experiences. You know, we don't start with a white sheet of paper when we are born. We already have different kinds of experience, and we have different sensitivities. We react to external stimulus in a different way that depends on the receptors and the neurological pathways. There are some differences, but they only change the whole thing a little bit. They only modify the whole thing a little bit, and that's why it's even more important for some than it is for others, to make sure that he never gets into such a problematic situation. And that's the reason why some people will try to find a solution even more quickly, more urgently, because it hurts so much. Think of ADHD. It's called attention disorder. Attention deficit. Typically, it's boys who have that problem, but it's not really an attention deficit. They just want to be noticed. They want to be seen. They want somebody to see them at last. So they do a lot of nonsense in class. And when you have 3 of these boys in a class at school, you can no longer teach the class. It's no longer possible. And then, of course, the teacher will talk to the parents and say, well, maybe you should take your son to the physician. And then there, the boy will get the diagnosis, and then he will get a drug, and then he will function again. But the brain of this boy will never learn to control an impulse, because the substance, the drug, does that now instead. So these are problematic developments that you can see everywhere. I don't want to dwell on this for too long, because I would want to spend a more optimistic, to spread a more optimistic message here, because the question is, how do we get out of these patterns? Two questions. Number one, you talked about this urge to create something and to explore. On the other hand, you want to save energy. Isn't that paradoxical? I mean, if you really want to save energy, then the human system wouldn't do anything anymore. It wouldn't want to explore anymore to save energy. That's the first question. Okay, I can answer that right away. It's not possible. You can't do nothing. There's always something happening to you. There's always some kind of disruption, something that influences you. That's why I said, as soon as I open the eyes and the light shines in, I'm already disrupted. There are always disruptions. Okay, and the second question is about, well, raising your kids. How can I define limits without turning my child into an object too much? Because that's the dilemma, isn't it? I mean, on the one hand, I totally understand what you just explained, but from the perspective of a father, of course, I want my child to be able to exist somehow in this context. So obviously, I'm going to make sure my child doesn't cast a stone into my neighbor's window. Yes, we'll come back to that later on. When I've really painted the entire picture, then this will hopefully become clearer. It should become clearer then. Could we have questions after the presentation, perhaps? Oh, yes, please. Yeah, maybe it's better if we don't interrupt this presentation too much. You can just wait and see what I have to tell you, and maybe then a few questions will really be answered anyway. I just have to make my presentation and talk about my points in a specific order. I can't tell you everything at once at the same time. So the point I've now reached was, you are all sitting here with solutions that are somehow implanted, that are, well, planted into your brains, solutions you found for yourselves in your lives, and that sometimes lead to negative results. Because it's your solution, so to speak, the one that you relate to. Let me talk about myself, not just about others. I once had this idea that I have to become a neurology, come what may. And I was totally enthusiastic about all the things that I found out as a neurologist. I found the whole system fascinating. I was really convinced. I spent day and night at a lab doing my research, so that was my solution. And if somebody had come to me and if somebody had said to me, why do you spend all your time with these pre-synapses while you have a wife and 2 kids at home? Are you crazy? And in that moment, I would have said, that's quite unfair. That's nasty. It's a mean thing to say. I have to do this. Because if I didn't go on now, everything I've done so far would have been for nothing. I have to go on doing this. And that's why you keep going. And that's something we have to understand. You still keep going because it's something you can identify yourself with, something you can relate to. Sometimes people are really in this rat race. They keep functioning and functioning and working and working. They are no longer alive, really, because they don't have any access to to the needs they have in their life, and they don't enjoy their lives anymore. They develop more and more psychological problems in a way. When you describe their mood, then typically you can call it resignation. So you're sitting there standing there in this mud that goes all the way to your head, And then you can tell that person, well, why don't you come out of that situation? Why don't you come out of that mud? But it doesn't work because, first of all, that person will be convinced that this is the right thing to do. And apart from that, it has been more or less successful that way for him so far. He doesn't want to leave that mud. If he left that mud, if he got out of that situation, he might risk an inconsistency that he would be confronted with, and he wants to avoid that at any cost. You know, if you leave the mud, then when you're out there on the dry land, it might be very cold, or there might be an abyss right behind it. And you don't want to fall down that abyss, so you prefer to keep sitting there in the mud. So there has to be something that gets that person out of it, out of that situation. And the only thing that can do that is making this man discover something or rediscover something that he no longer feels in this mud. So, like I said, we see these people around us. And some of these people want to have power over others, or some of these people want to be important. Some of these people want attention. Some of these people want to be seen. They will always try to rip off others. I don't want to go into too much detail now, but you know these people. I mean, none of them is here today, of course. So we all, you know, that's why you are asking this question. We all have, well, turned this into a habit. We have turned it into a habit. We have developed this habit to turn others into an object because they turn us into an object. And that's why we can hardly imagine that things might also be different. And one thing that is not possible is to change somebody else. I mean, informing somebody, explaining it to somebody else, telling somebody else what would be good for him, forget about that. You know, it's love's labor lost. It doesn't work that way. Nobody is going to change because you make an effort, because you try your best. The only thing you could do is you could help that person to be hopeful again, to have this hope again that things might be different. And then you can make this hope so strong that the person will change. But at the end of the day, either the person wants to change, and then he can do that, or he doesn't want to change, and then he won't be able to do that anyway. So the question is, the big question is, what might motivate a person to get out of this mud, out of this rat race that he's gotten into? What would motivate him to say, yes, I want to get out of this? And there are actually three things that might happen, and the first two are rubbish.
The first one is absolute shit. The first option is burnout with your aspirations to have a great career, with your ideas about what is essential in the world. You may take the extra mile, you may go out of your way. Quite often in social professions, this is the caregiver's complex, and you care about others, and then sooner or later you suffer a burnout. Or the successful entrepreneur, until traveling around the world until he breaks down in the utter burnout. Now, those living demands, the needs, for example, the need for autonomy and the need for relationships, for bonding, will never go away. Yet, in order to keep functioning as you thrived in the past, you have inhibiting frameworks, inhibiting factors, well, that help you functioning, but underneath you are still a living being. If somebody is bumping against a wall with a strategy, it may well happen that they enter into contact with the inner split-up self. And just a few people are so deeply moved. They are so shaken by this experience that they finally realize there is something living in them, and then they decide overnight, out. I will leave that status, and you don't need a therapy. You read this, for example, a successful entrepreneur that starts a new career as a beekeeper. Everybody who realizes this will lose everything, friendships, your house Most of the times the wives too will have gone away. Not easily will you embark on such a journey. That's why 90% of all the people affected by burnout are rather inclined to continue like in the past. The better variant is, well, I always hope that it may succeed to enable such experience. It's called a Stars Hour, Sternstunde, the highlights, where you will have again and again these moments of utter happiness. For example, in front of a beautiful tree or under the sky with stars, and then you kneel down, you are deeply touched, you are moved, because all of a sudden you have entered again into contact with this inner self that had been paralyzed for all too long. Again, we have some people, few people, who take the decision, I will not continue like this. Out. They exit the previous existence. And you may suddenly realize it's seldom, it's a rare happening, it's painful, it's problematic, because you are no longer a good fit. That's why I would suggest amongst us men, one could also try to be more loving, more caring to oneself. That seems to be the healing process. If you start just being more loving, ask yourself, is it really doing something good to me, what I'm doing? And if your inner voice responds, no, it's no good, then I need to find a way to end it. Many things cannot be ended, but I can instead do so many things. I do not have to go into each bakery to get such a sweet thing, nor do I have to talk to people to show my face. I do not have to socialize with people that are harmful to me, just in way of eating, or the television programming, or the internet service. What's the end? Why do I have to watch this idiotic thriller or this idiotic football match? Either the thriller is so good that I cannot get to sleep, or it's so bad so that I feel so excited and frustrated that I've watched this thriller. So why not just switch off? And all of a sudden, you have the entire day for yourself. You can read a book. You can pass a nice evening with a partner. All of a sudden, you have a wealth of opportunities. Well, I'm ridiculing this. You know what you are reconnecting with your needs. So you become the master of your own, even in prison. If you are locked up in prison, and everybody will tell you it's utterly unfree as a prisoner, you can either bump your head against the wall or you sit down on the bed, but you can say, okay, it's uncozy, but I have the possibility to find something to shape my life. I can play chess, I can write poetry. It is always doable, always possible. You must never let loose of hope. So as soon as you do something that is good for you, you feel connected. And if you ask, what is good for me? What would be good for me? And if somebody says, football, look at the next national game. Is it really a living need, or have I just been talked into it? Or the next cruise, or the next car that you want to buy? Is it really so important, or is it something that is so important that you cannot do without? In doing so, you will end up with a question, always by necessity, that your two basic needs. Do something that connects you again with other human beings, and do again something where you can shape your own life. And then something very crazy starts happening. You have satisfied those two fundamental needs. You are no longer a needy person. you have satisfied your basic needs with these basic needs. It's like hunger and thirst. As long as one feels hunger or thirst, they cannot think of anything else. And then this basic need, like hunger or thirst, passes away. You are connected once again with your natural needs, living needs. You are no longer a needy person. So you don't need to make other people into your objects or a projection of your own needs. You can satisfy your own needs. And then you are deeply embedded in your own force as a man. Instead of using others to get something from them, you can, for the very first time in your life, give something without the expectation of anything given back. The last time I delivered a presentation here, well, what was it? The highlight is we must become loving beings, and you can become a loving person only if you have to give something. You cannot be a loving person if you want to get something from others. Attention, you need to give something. A monk from the Middle Ages, love is the absolute interest in the growth of the other. It's a cool statement. It's the absolute interest. No matter how the other is, you will do anything to bring the other in their own capacity and their own capability. Otherwise, it's only an abuse or using of the other to fulfill one's own needs. Which brings me almost to the end of my considerations. But we must not shy away from this truth. It's so simple. The brain wants to save energies. The brain encapsulates and memorizes the solutions. Many of those solutions are good in the short term. For example, drinking alcohol or booze may be a good solution in the short run, but in the long run, it's just shitty. Sooner or later, it risks becoming part of your own identity, so you can no longer part ways with that solution. Before that, you have become entangled. That's why I like the formulation of Kant. I can finally disentangle myself once I have unleashed my potential. I will always have a narrow mindset. I will always strive to just satisfy my basic needs or things that I tend to believe to need. Now the crucial question is, why are we doing it the wrong way? We inhibit each other in unfolding our talents and our gifts. There must be a reason to this, and the reason is, as we are social beings, even a social community in which we live needs a coherent principle, something that creates cohesion. Not everybody can do as they like. We cannot accept chaotic, intermingling. Probably during the sedentary way of life. While the sedentary way of life was developed, this fixed order was developed. But when they wandered around as hunters and gatherers, well, people said, well, they had bigger brains even there. Yes, the world was so rich that there was place for everybody. Someone was knowledgeable about herbs. The third one knew how to kindle fire. And the others were famous navigators. And so everybody played a role because they were good at it. That's this modern leadership style that we would love to have. The one who is best qualified for a certain project should take the leadership role. This is an attempt to break down the hierarchies. Back then, well, the human beings were so successful because it was also a possibility in those individualistic communities. Everybody counts. If somebody anybody found something new, they shared it right away, immediately. That's how culture spread. Language was developed in those previous archaic communities. We have nice experiments, for example, apes were sent to an isolated island, and then they were given dirty potatoes. And sooner or later, a wiser old monkey starts washing the potatoes. And this is the start of culture, civilization. So we developed until the first started growing seeds and grow cattle, and they could feed the community. That's how farming was brought about. And others were more than willing to follow suit, because they knew a thing or two. They knew their way around in their world. It was also very comfortable and lazy to have someone who provided food. That's how hierarchical power structures were brought about. To the present day, we have hierarchical structures, hierarchies, as a successful social system, which serves the purpose to create coherence in society. It's the principle of cohesion. If somebody tells you what the right direction is, you can bundle energies, you can unleash war, you can irrigate the Nile Valley. People have used it with such clamorous success that the individual could no longer unfold their own capacities and talents, because it was all about the benefit of the entire society. As such hierarchies were unfolding, and a lower class was generated, those who were at the bottom line. It's not so comfortable down there in the doldrums. You need to find your way out, to climb out. That's why the people strived to get to the top, away from the rock bottom level. And the most simple thing is to discover something new, or to invent something that others can use. Well, we have been having this model for 10,000 years. Again and again, people invent something new, and this is a cultural achievement. You end up with a digitized, globalized world where everything depends on everything. It has become so complex that one thing is no longer possible. Hierarchy. Hierarchy is no. If the federal chancellor speaks of this time of transition, it's not the Zeitenwende, the turnover of the times, or the big transition. It's rather a relapse into the old structures if an autocrat, a tyrant, forces us to do. Now, the proper change of the times, or the tides, would imply that we unlearn hierarchical structures. Without those hierarchical structures, we can lead our lives in autonomy. Again, the release or redemption from self-inflicted slavery, as Kant put it, by doing the one thing that we have recognized as the essential and relevant thing. We develop a new world. So much needs to be done. And there, space would be for everybody with the special talents, even for men. There would be also their dedicated place where they can unfold their capacities. By the same token, women could do so as well. You would no longer need ordering instructions and projections of your own objectives. So that's my end point. Well, I have finally come full circle. Thank you very much for listening so carefully to me. Thank you. Thank you. So,
Thank
thank you from the bottom of my heart, dear Gerald. I need to come full circle too. Please stay with me on the floor this weekend. We have heard so much about being a man, also in the connection of the war. You talked about objectivization, you talked about coherence in brain. From your perspective, what have the two things to do with each other? War, being a man, objectivation and coherence. The best thing that we have achieved so far is to have more and more insights. How to manage conflicts. We have learned this, more or less, not well enough, but what would be of the essence? We should become peacemakers, and we must understand to manage. You can manage something with your reasoning. You can become a peacemaker only from the bottom of your heart. What I have tried to describe, that you get out of this needy position. The condition of today's world is the result of the activity of so many needy persons. Someone who is unified with himself, who can donate something, will not do all those things. They will look around. What is needed? Where am I needed? Where can I make a contribution? How can I bring people together that feel similarly? That's why we organize such events. It's not an end in itself. We try to open up the eyes, to understand what's going on with us, so that we do not fall in the trap of the continuous propaganda and these ideologies that are meant to fool us. I'm a biologist by training. I have always been surprised. I have really read Charles Darwin. Darwin has never said what you can read today in our school books or textbooks, that it's about competition and that the strongest ones will prevail. He knew that this was not right because he wrote a second book. The first one is called The Natural Selection and the Origin of Species, and the second one was Sexual Selection, Origin of Man. No one wanted to read the second book. People were not interested. The first one was a best-selling book, and they shaped it into an ideology to justify their hierarchical model. At the beginning of this, why have the giraffes such long necks? It's like an orgasm. Well, why is it? Because we have learned the giraffes have such long necks to be able, because due to coincidental mutations or accidental mutations, there were some specimens that had higher necks and could reach the acacia leaves. But is that the reason? No, the giraffes or all male animals have certain behavioral patterns in which to impose themselves on the females. The same is true for us. With the giraffes, it's the beating with the head, knocking one's head. The one who wins over all the male rivals will get the female. And those with longer necks won out in the rivalry. That's it was not about the improvement of feeding the species. It was about sex. It was all about sex. Yeah. By the way, you could also make a whole lecture. We asked, by which criteria do men select their females, and why do wives select these men? Well, men look under the criterion of physical attractiveness. Over so many generations, men select more and more beautiful women, and women become ever more beautiful. They owe it to us.
Women also have a criterion they apply when they choose their men, the so-called social status. So, at least for reproduction, they will choose a man who has achieved something, a certain social status. And it goes on like that for tens of thousands of years. And we now see the result in our current society. Men who always try to be in the center of the attention, men who always have to play the macho. At least that's what it used to be like in the past century. And I'm afraid women made a big contribution to that development. They would have to change their selection criteria. And the general thing, you still see that when you have a look at mothers today. They treat their sons in a different way than their daughters. They want to make sure that the son will turn into something, into somebody important. They still have that mindset. They want their sons to play a role in life, and they do everything they can to make that possible. Maybe some of you fell victim to such a mother. Forgive her. Forgive her. There's no point in, well, being angry about that. Okay, so that's really the end of my presentation. If you have more questions, we have a mic somewhere. Our time's up. Well, we can take a few questions at least.
Zum Anschluss, also wollte ich fragen,
I'd like to pick up on something that was said before, and maybe this is a bit private, so you don't really have to answer this question. If there's no answer, I accept that as well. That's fine with me. But I wanted to ask you, you see, I don't think I'm homosexual. Well, I am not really homosexual, but, you know, there was this time when I felt this lust. And then I tried to put myself into a woman's shoes. And my question is, has it ever happened to you that women try to go to bed with you after a presentation? Because in a way, it's also connected to lust, isn't it? I mean, such a presentation. Well, it's good we're only men here. No, seriously, there are women who... Well, that's okay, fair enough. But the question is, what do they like about me in such a moment, if that happens? I don't really think they like me, but they like the performance. So in a way, they project an idea that they have in their mind onto me. And if a woman definitely wants me after a presentation, then I run away. I run because she needs me. She needs me. Because sooner or later she will say something like, I can no longer live without you. So I really run, because that's the worst thing that can happen. From your perspective as a neurobiologist, how many percent of the sexual selection is biologically determined? In other words, how many of it comes from the genes and how much of it is really cultural? Well, in a way, the two have mixed, really. On the one hand, you have the genes, but then you also have culture. I mean, it makes sense biologically for a woman to look for a reproduction partner who can more or less earn a living and help her raise the children. So in a way, that's a biological need. But of course, it's perverse when you think that this biological need should mean that you look for somebody who has a yacht in the Mediterranean Sea, a boat somewhere, somebody very rich.
Hi, das war echt ein geiler Vortrag.
Hi, that was really a cool presentation. I have a short question. In the beginning, you gave us an example of this father who was walking there with a child, and then they saw the beggar sitting there on the street, and he gave the child, I mean, the father gives the child the impression that this is not good and explains it logically to the child, and that's how the child will then save this solution. And later on, this solution may not be good, it may not be helpful. So what would you do? I mean, if it was your child, you walk down the street with your child, and then there's a beggar sitting there, and it's an uncomfortable situation. Well, I would take my child by the hand and walk to the beggar. And then,
Ja, aber
well,
doch
then I
nicht
would
jedes
talk with
Mal.
them.
Also-
But not every time, would you? No, but at least once. So that the child can see this at least once. So that together with the child we can have this experience that there is such misery in the world. So that the child's natural feelings can exist, can be permitted, and are not ignored or shut down. Because I want the child to preserve this feeling. The child feels empathy for the beggar, and the child should remain able or capable of empathy. But that's not possible if the father just pulls the child away. Because the child will always look at you and use you as a reference, as a point of orientation. And the child should not get the impression that the feeling it has for the beggar is wrong. And then you can discuss this together and find out what can be done. Maybe it turns out that the beggar comes from Syria. And then you can agree with your child that you support children in Syria, that you make donations for projects in Syria to make sure that the children there won't become beggars one day in order to find a solution. And then one more thing, about not turning your child into an object. One way for us to turn a child into an object is by scaring the child, by saying things like, if you don't perform at school, then you will never be successful in your life. That's a way to scare children. It's the same with brushing teeth. If you don't brush your teeth, then your teeth will be rotten. If children only brush their teeth for that reason, they will always just brush their teeth because they are afraid, out of fear. But you can do it differently. You can take the child on your arm, brush your own teeth, and then after a few seconds, the child will try to grab the toothbrush. And then you can say, well, by the way, I've got this special toothbrush for you. It's very small, and toothpaste just for you. And then the child will brush their teeth simply because you do that. You never turn the child into an object, but the child will enjoy brushing the teeth. So it's really important to be a good role model. You can't fake or pretend anything. You have to be a good role model. It's like when you tell your child that sports cars are horrible because they need so much fuel and people drive them too fast and that sports cars are horrible. And then there's the Ferrari, the red Ferrari coming by. What will happen? The child will look at the red Ferrari and then at you. And it will see the look in your eyes, and the child will see that you love it. And then a week later, all of a sudden, the child will know the name of all sports cars in the world by heart, simply because, and the reason for that is the child has noticed what he or she has to do in order to be loved by you. And that's what I mean when I say unconditional. You should try to treat your child in such a way that they don't feel the need, the obligation to do you a favor, to please you. Of course, children will always try to please you, but the child should not lose. Children should not lose their authenticity that way. And one more thing about being a loving parent. Sometimes when I tell somebody, you could love yourself more, and then that person will say, well, I don't want to be selfish, I don't want to be an egoist. And that's stupid. We learned it that way, but it's stupid. Because then I tell that person, an egoist always needs somebody else for the performance. If somebody who is selfish is all alone in a forest, he won't be selfish anymore because there's nobody else around. But when I look for something that is good for me, I like to be in the forest on my own. I don't panic. I don't need anybody else in that moment. So that's the difference between doing something good for yourself and loving yourself and, well, selfishness or egoism. It's exactly the opposite.